In our study of Sri Aurobindo's synthesis of yoga, we are in the chapter titled The Planes of Our Existence, in which Sri Aurobindo describes the various planes of consciousness from their first principles, beginning with what in the totality of creation makes for the distinction of different planes, and then what characterizes each of these planes. We have in particular explored the character of the physical plane and are in the midst of the vital plane, and later he will focus on the mental and then the spiritual. But then, what is it that links these planes? What happens between them? And this is the paragraph that we are in now, where he describes in particular the close influence of the vital plane upon the physical. But as we have seen, there is a two-way influence. Throughout this chapter, Sri Aurobindo is also focusing upon the fundamental principles of this whole realm of knowledge and practice, which is called occultism. I think you want to reduce the fan is okay. Yes. Our interest in the passage we are now reading is also to explore what are the various applications in the occult sciences to each of these statements that Sri Aurobindo has been making. And in brief, looking back at what we covered the last few weeks, Sri Aurobindo described how the material world is a sort of projection from the vital. That is, the life world has a much firmer base, and out of the life world, the part that wants to project itself to experience form and limitation, as if pushes out of itself the physical world, and then puts a pressure on the physical world to form the experience of life in it and create life forms. So if you look at the flower, there is a vital energy experience properly belonging to the vital world, which is the truth of this flower as a life flower. Out of that, a projection of it forming, densifying, or making a coarser, cruder, objectified version of it is what creates the physical world, and in it awakens the formation of the flower. And so, in the next important idea from this is that everything in the physical world has its corresponding vital formations or powers, which in fact influence things of the physical world, and even the most ordinary, the most material, the most elemental. But going further, the vital sources, the vital forms or energies, being conscious, being living, can also be treated as conscious and independent beings. And so, out of the vital, where everything is conscious beings, the physical world as if projects, but also the influence of the vital continues into the physical world. And then he says, the influences of the life world are always pouring out on the material existence and producing their powers and results. And then in return, from the physical, there is also an influence which goes back and modifying things in the vital from the experience, from the influence that the vital brought into the physical. And then coming to specifically the human being, individual, human, in our life parts, we are experiencing all the time a complex, rich influence from the vital world. Equally, our desires, our emotions, our life impulses produce their effects in the vital worlds, and there is this constant interchange that takes place. And from this, he comes to another important idea, that the life world, being a world primarily of desire, seeking always to satisfy its desires, seeking always to fulfill its impulses, and desire being itself always a limitation, the life world is split into what is called positive or negative desire impulses. Beings who are beneficial or malevolent. And the fact that we are constantly open to this domain in our desire parts brings us under the influence of both kinds, beneficent and maleficent. And so there too are benefic and malefic powers of good desire and evil desire, which concern themselves with us even when we are ignorant of and unconcerned with them. That is, even if we are not interested in them, they are interested in us. They want to do their thing in us or through us. And sometimes, if they find a strong alignment of type, here's a person who is by nature always upset. Here's a person who is by nature always jealous. Here's someone who is by nature always lustful. Beings aligned to those kinds of energies will be attracted to such people and will always seek to fulfill themselves through those people. Equally, on the positive side, here's a person who is idealistic, who wants to do good to others, who wants to help, and the beings who are aligned to that kind of impulse are attracted to such people and seek to push their influence. Now, consider this. The vital world is so large, with so many domains and worlds in them, most of them not interested in the physical world. But the few that are interested are already far more rich and complex than the physical world is. All of them now crowd around to try to act on and work through human beings and occasions that human beings create for them to exercise their influence. Somebody has this wonderful desire to create a beautiful garden in which people can come to rest, enjoy beautiful nature, feel rejuvenated, feel healthy, and the person starts making efforts. He has nothing to start with except a wonderful idea, an inspiration. And there could be beings which say, this interests us, this is what we would like to do, and they would crowd around such a person and try to work, helping, pushing their agenda. There will equally be beings with slightly different ideas who may say, can we use his ambition to do our thing and turn that ambition in a different direction? So in the very fact that a human being starts working for an object, there's a crowd of influences that come and try to use, not only to assist in the object, but to modify it to suit their priorities or even to hinder it. Equally, the malefic beings will say, hey, we don't want a beautiful garden here, we would rather keep it desert. And so they will try to bring in their contrary influence. And so he's giving you a very complex picture of influences working together, often in conflict with each other, but using human beings as their instruments to actualize themselves. And these powers, he says, and we saw this line last time, are not merely tendencies and inconscient forces, but they are conscious powers, beings, living influences. And so the next step, which is towards the end of this paragraph, as we awaken to the higher planes of our existence, we become aware of them, all these powers, as friends or enemies, powers which seek to possess or which we can master, overcome, pass beyond, and leave behind. So the first step really is to become conscious of our own higher parts. We are normally so closed off to what happens to us on these inner layers that we do not even know that most of the time we are merely tools, played upon by these influences, positive, negative, mixed, all kinds. As we begin to become conscious in our higher parts, we realize, we can feel, we can sense, there's something, some influence, it's not mine. It's entering as a suggestion, it's entering as an impulse, it's aligning itself, supporting, or it's contradicting, working against, and you begin to sense it. In those parts of you, of which you have become now more conscious, in which they were always working, but you were unconscious of it. How that is to happen will be the discussion of the next paragraph, where he takes up the question of why we are so unconscious to all these things, and then obviously what can we do to become conscious of them. But right now, as we become conscious, we discover some are friendly, some are even enemies. And then, what's the next step when we become conscious? We notice they put an influence on us, whether friendly or enemy. On the other hand, we can reverse the game and push back. And this is the character of the vital world and the vital consciousness, that it is always a domain of competing energies. Any consciousness of the vital meeting another consciousness of the vital has a relationship, vital being a world of desire. It has a relationship of stronger desire or weaker desire, or the direction of desire being conflicting with this direction of desire, or simply the strength of one overwhelming another and subsuming it. And then you will have a larger desire bundle within which there are smaller desires attached, as if hanging on to fulfill themselves, modified by the larger. Now all of this is extremely important, because we are all the time under such influences. To begin with, as soon as you meet a person in the physical world, his vital energy and your vital energy enter in contact. And immediately there is a shift, an influence of one on the other. If the two are reasonably in affinity, there will be an alignment and you will feel good. If the two are very different, there will be at first a tentative attempt to connect, and if a connection is not made, either one side withdraws or both withdraw, or one will seek to dominate or overwhelm the other. Now, entering into a particular space of human life, such as business, where there are competing interests trying to fulfill their object, the tendency to dominate is the most common. If you enter in a meeting where two different parties are now engaged in a discussion, the character of business is that each side wants to assert its objectives and fulfill its objectives. And if the two cannot work it out by mutual benefit, then one will tend to overwhelm the other. In the first thought that a businessman has for such a meeting is, what's my advantage? What's his disadvantage? How can I impose my advantage over his disadvantage? And in converse, what is his advantage and my disadvantage? How do I manage his advantage? So the implied object here is a vital domination to somehow sway the other person's interests to serve yours. And it's happening from both sides. Who will win? Well, the one who is more strong. And there is first level of conflict, which is of the stronger energy overwhelming the weaker. But the second level, which is more subtle, where the stronger actually attempts to create an image of affinity and mutuality. Let's work together. But secretly, the stronger energy is surrounding you, enveloping you, infusing itself in you, to make you feel as if you just had a wonderful, friendly exchange, not realizing you've been changed completely. And so you just signed a deal on the dotted line, you go away, and then you wonder, why did I do that? I'm losing so much here. Why didn't I think of it? I was conscious, but it just felt right. I just got carried away in the moment. Now what happens in this kind of energy exchange? The environment is extremely important. If the meeting takes place at the place owned by the first person, where his energy or his interests, his objectives are strongly rooted, the second person is already at a disadvantage. So you'll notice in this kind of an energetic, let's say, competition, often recognizing that the other person is strong, they will choose to meet in a neutral space, so that you do not give to the other an unnatural advantage. Now, I'm explaining this in great detail because in the domain of business, this is obvious. What's not obvious is that this is happening all the time. The moment you enter someone's personal space, automatically your energetic relation is respectful, withdrawn, limited, not dominating, not expanding into their space, which would be too invasive. Automatically, therefore, their space has a greater strength over yours in consciousness terms. Automatically, there's a seepage of what is existing there into you. Simply that poise of being respectful and not imposing yourself puts a relationship of this kind. Now, this is extremely important in the domain of human life, in the vital domain of human life, because there are always implied hierarchies. When you enter a government office, you will notice instantly your state changes in relation to that space. You feel somehow subdued, hesitant, on the back foot. The other side feels as if they own the place, they own the country, they can do what they like, they can say no, and you have no recourse. The power structure has a hierarchy. But the same officer, when he goes to the room of his boss, the boss can say no, and this man has no recourse. And there's a series of layers of hierarchy of energies. What is important to recognize is the mind values, the life values which are established on those levels seep down into the lower. And this is the reason why the person at the top of any institutional structure who holds the reins of power will always influence the entire culture of the institution, even if they do not actively engage with it. Just the fact that they shape a certain value system at the top is going to percolate down, and very quickly at the level of the vital energies. And it will shape and recast the whole institution. This is true not only of a small institution, a little company, it's true equally of an entire country. When, I give an example of why this becomes important. When somebody enters a space now with a good intention, but the space has a vibration of a contrary intention, the good intention will become less effective or utterly ineffective. And I'll take an explicit example of a person dealing in vital energies as a healer. Your goal now is to help somebody who is sick. And so you enter the space where the person is sick and you try to give him some positive life force, pranic energy to revitalize, heal the person. But if there's a strong energetic imprint of the contrary energy, to be sick, to remain sick, to refuse help, your healing effect will be nominal or entirely fail. Now this can happen in strange ways. You enter somebody's space with the patient. The patient wants to be healed, the healer can heal, but the space in which they are doing the whole exercise is not supportive. Again, there will be a failure. What defines the space? Other people who might be around. So this typically happens when healers or psychics, as they call them, are going to demonstrate their ability in a laboratory setting. The environment of the laboratory has its own energy field and authority field, and if the scientists are skeptical, you can come and attempt to demonstrate, and either you will have a weak response or an utter failure. The same person taken out of that space without those scientists will have a strong response and dramatic success. What we don't realize is, in the very act of entering a space like this, our power of effectivity is modified and even can be completely neutralized if the other side is strong. And what is required on your part is to be able to exercise your vitality to reverse or to create a bubble of protection which is strong enough to oppose the negative energy, and most of us can't do that. We just don't have the capacity. There's some very interesting letters of Sri Aurobindo and the mother which deal with further some of these relationships, and particularly in the context of what happens when we go to sleep and we are entirely exposed in our vital body, in the vital world, and what happens there. And some of that will help us to understand the examples which the text we're reading and the examples which we have looked at. This is from one of mother's conversations with the students, and somebody asks, in vital nightmares, which part of the being goes out of the body? Mother, you're vital. Not the whole of it, for that would produce a cataleptic state, but a portion of the vital goes out for a stroll. Some always go to the nastiest places and so have very bad nights. The possibilities in these nightly rambles are innumerable. It may be a very small thing, just a little portion of your being, but if it is conscious, that is enough to give you a fine little nightmare. So a tiny part of your body wandering into a domain of the vital which is nasty, and that's all you need. You know, and then she explains now the whole rationale behind it. You know, when you sleep, the inner beings are not concentrated upon the body. They go out and become more or less independent. A limited independence, but independence all the same. And they go to dwell in their own domains. Now this is very interesting because she is not talking of one vital being, she is talking of your inner beings, meaning many parts of your inner, levels, layers. You could say generally the vital or the mental, but often within that there are finer gradations which are all, because our concentration is not so fixed on the body, they're all released, relaxed, and can instantly settle at their own normal domain of consciousness of that world. And so they're free now to explore, to wander, or just to drift aimlessly. The mind more so. They go to dwell in their own domains. The mind more so, for it is hardly held within the body. It is only concentrated but not contained in the body. Interesting idea. So we'll explore this further when we come to the portion of the mental body and the mental world. But the vital body is much more physically fixed. The mental body is much more free, and it's not even tied to the body. It's concentrated on the body because all our attention is through the physical senses, but otherwise the mental awareness itself is much more fluid, as almost like a field of awareness. The mind, however, is such a supple substance that it is sufficient to think about a person in order to be with that person, or at least partially, mentally. If you think strongly of a place, a part of your mind is there. So if just now you remember a place and feel that place, already a part of your mind is there. A part, not the whole of it. But that's a part enough to make a link through which you can begin to feel that place, at least the mental atmosphere of that place. So let's say we are here in Auroville. You concentrate and remember what it feels like to be in the Matri Mandir. And if you remember and feel, immediately a part of your mind is already there. And it forms like a link, and you can feel, remember the vibes, feel it more and more, until a part of your vital also now begins to feel the vibes in the vital energy. And it's as if a thread of consciousness through which you go back and are drawn deeper into the state of consciousness in that environment. As if through the mental link one expands, one extends into the more spiritual and vital realms. And a little bit of it begins to fill us and change our state. Just that. So, a part of your mind is there. Distance, so to say, does not exist for the mind. Of course, to have a mind centralized around the body requires good training. Very few people have a mind with a well-defined form. It is like clouds which roll, come and go. Even to have a vital with a form similar to that of your physical body, an analogous form, it must be very much individualized, very much centralized. The mind, still more, it must be completely individualized, centralized, organized around the psychic center in order to have a definite form. You will see in books of these things and out-of-body experiences, they will show you like a replica of the physical body drifting up from the physical body and wandering around, walking with 2 hands, 2 legs and a head. It's not so. Because in most cases our vital body is extremely fluid, unformed, the mental being even more. And what you normally view, if you have the subtle sight, is more like a cloud-like form which drifts off or expands, and a part of it drifts off and wanders. And the cloud-like form then again concentrates, settles, and then fixes into the physical body and gets attached to it. Still the borderline of it, the larger surrounding, circumconscient is the word Sri Aurobindo uses, surrounding consciousness of our being, which is in large part mental, is much more fluid and cloud-like. And sitting here, if your mind begins to daydream and wander, remember someone, some place, some incident, already it's drifted off like a cloud, fluid. It's not fixed in the body. The moment it turns to the physical consciousness and the physical senses, a portion of it gets concentrated, but a large part may still be wandering, unformed and inchoate. And what she is describing here, to centralize it, to organize it, gives to it a more distinct form, both for the vital and the mental body. And such people are very few, because most of the time we have really not developed that. So then she explains this. There are people who spend their life organizing their mind. I have known some who had made of their mind a kind of fortress, a huge construction. They had made of their mind quite a big edifice, very powerful, and of such fixity and with such solid walls that they had lost all contact with the outer mental world. They lived completely within their own construction, and all the phenomena of their consciousness were of their own making. They retained contact with their own vital and their body in a way, but with all the phenomena of their consciousness lodged within their mental construction, they could no longer get out of it. Well, this happens very strongly to people who seek for a spiritual life through the classical methods of a renunciation of the material consciousness, a concentration on their inner being and identification with it. If I gave you the names of some, you would be quite astonished. Now, this is interesting because there are many famous individuals who have declared having great experiences, but it could be entirely within the narrow construction of their mental consciousness. And they are imprisoned in it. To make a breach in one of the walls, at first they are completely upset. Then they come to regard that the force that could do this as a force of terrible destruction, a manifestation of a hostile force of the worst kind. And this often happens to such people when they come into a genuine spiritual space and find that their formations suddenly begin to fizzle out or have no value in that space. Then someone asks, what is a mental nightmare? So the vital nightmare was your vital body going into this strange energy pattern. What is a mental nightmare, mother? When there is a chaos in the brain or a local fever, a particular turmoil in the brain, an overstrain, or if there is a want of control, you let yourself be possessed by mental formations. This is what happens most often. Mental formations which most often you have yourself made. And as the control of the rational waking consciousness has gone, all this begins to dance. A saraband in the head with a kind of raging madness, ideas get entangled, collide, fight. It is truly hallucinating. Then unless you have the power to bring a great peace into your head, a great tranquility, a very strong and pure light, well, it is 10 times worse than a vital nightmare. Now here she describes vital nightmare versus mental nightmare, and you'll see this is very interesting. The worst of a vital nightmare consists generally in fighting with an enemy who wants to kill you, and you strike him terrible blows and the blows never hit. You exert all your force, all your energy, and you do not succeed in touching your adversary. He is there in front of you, he threatens you, he is going to strangle you, or you gather all your strength, you try to strike, but nothing touches him. When the struggle is like that, hand to hand, with a being who throws himself upon you, it is particularly painful. That is why you are not advised to go out of the body unless you have the necessary power or purity. You see, and she explains why this happens. You see, in this kind of nightmare, the force you want to use is the memory of a physical force. But one may have great physical strength, be a first-class boxer, and yet be completely powerless in the vital world because one does not have the necessary vital power. Now, I took this passage particularly for this reason. Here you are in a physical world with somebody with a dominating vital trying to bully you into submission to agree with him. What do? You go back to your memory of your physical force. You talk louder, you shout louder, you make gestures, you threaten with words. It doesn't work because his vital force is stronger. So the same thing which is happening in the vital world in your dream state is being replicated in the physical world because finally it's a conflict of vital energies. What is needed, she says, is not memory of your physical force. It's the energy of the vital that you have to push out and either hold your ground or reverse the balance, subdue the other. Now you'll recall we read other passages where this happens, And what happens in the dream state, in the vital world, let's say the force comes to attack you, you see it as a tiger chasing you. The moment you put yourself in a relationship of fear, the vital world, remember, is not a world of form. It is a world of energies. So the relationship of fear puts that in an exaggerated position of strength, and you in a weakened position of strength. The tiger becomes big, you become small. You get overwhelmed by the force. But if, as Mother has said in the portion we read earlier, she said, you look back, straight, without fear. Look the tiger in the eye, but with zero fear. What have you done? You've changed the balance of relationship. I stand my ground, your energy is fixed. The opposing energy which is coming towards you now is unable to push. And the balance is changed. You are the larger energy, that is the small. And then in the dream what happens? The tiger shrinks, becomes a cat, and runs away. The physical, the shape or form represents the shift in energy. Now, exactly the same thing happens in the physical world, in a physical life, at an energetic level. So you have entered a space where you know the other person is stronger, but if you go with a quiet confidence, either rooted in your own deeper parts, and if you have worked on the vital consciousness, you root yourself in the silence of the vital. What they call today static power, the power of vitality, not agitated but rooted in a deeper peace. If possible, leaning back on the peace of the self, or remembering the presence of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo, rooted in that, holding your ground. As you enter that space, there's immediately a shift of the dominance of energy. And the other person's response completely changes, where earlier he might have been hostile or rejecting. Suddenly there's a shift in the relationship and he says, yes. And afterwards he wonders, why did I say yes? And he may rationalize to himself, oh, it was a good person, so I agreed. But the fact is there was a complete shift in the energy, and one can see this happen. It's so interesting. Of course, when backed by a spiritual power, the whole thing changes spontaneously. This was something which would happen to people, some of the most powerful people in the world, who prime ministers sometimes, coming to meet the Mother, and in front of her they would become like children and suddenly lose all their sense of importance, and they would be completely vulnerable in their state. And in that poise they could receive something and go back filled with the energy or the power that she gave them. And I remember this incident was narrated by Udar when Indira Gandhi visited the Mother. It was, I think, in the late 60s. She was at that time in a power struggle in politics, and the old guard of the Congress was of the stronger vitality. She was the weaker one. Further, being a woman in the field of politics, okay, she was the daughter of a former prime minister, but still they were trampling over her, but she had a certain force by which she was holding ground. She came to visit the Mother, and Udar narrates how she went in. Mother asked to meet her alone, and Udar at least was not there. And after that, Udar says, she went in like a lamb and came out like a tigress. And afterwards, when he met the Mother, Mother said, I brought down upon her the highest power and she absorbed it all. Now she goes back from the ashram, back to Delhi, and suddenly a series of dramatic political events follow. She splits the Congress, creates her own Congress bracket I for Indira. I could say the ego I, but still Indira. And suddenly the whole balance of power tilted, the old guard suddenly became irrelevant. All of them finished their political life. They were no more elected, it was done. And the whole power structure tilted, and after that for a couple of decades the Congress I continued as the dominant power. She then came to power with an overwhelming majority and all kinds of things followed. But all this was the result of this power which was brought in her and it went and did its thing. Now what she did, what she spoke was irrelevant. The power she brought changed the balance. And politics particularly, being a domain primarily of power, it was decisive in its change. Such things happen all the time in the physical world. They are much more easy to recognize in dream state when we are in the vital body, because there the form instantly reflects the balance of power. But the fact is, this is what's happening behind the scenes when we meet on a material level. And that's why what we're studying here is so important. Although he is describing the character of the vital world and things of vital world, their action in the physical world is also of the same grade, of the same type, because so much of our physical life is primarily formed by our vitality and the play of vital energies. So, as we awaken to the higher planes of our existence, we become aware of these things. I'll just complete the passage though. And then Mother completes, as for the mental nightmares, that kind of frightful saraband in the head, one has altogether the impression of going mad. Someone asks her later how to get free of this or overcome the mental nightmare. And Mother stays in a long silence, and then she says, that's the way. Bringing silence in the mind. And the same, of course, in the vital, tremendously amplifies the power of the vital to be effective. She has another discussion here of what happens, the form of the vital, and I will read this a little bit because it builds on the previous idea. Someone asks, at the time of death, the psychic being goes to take rest, isn't it? But the vital is stopped in the vital world. Does this prevent the psychic from going to rest? Mother. But the vital does not go to rest, nor does the mental being. Generally, they are dissolved. It is only if one has followed a yoga throughout his whole life, if one has taken great care to individualize, to centralize the vital and the mental around the psychic being, that they remain. That happens once in 10 million cases. It is very exceptional. So, the full integration of the mental and vital being around the psychic being is so rare because we never work upon it consciously. We live our vital life driven by the vital impulses, and they are chaotic. They are impulses after all. So one impulse comes, then another influence, another influence. We are under influence of a motley of these energies trying to work themselves out through us, and the same in the mental. She observes elsewhere, more than 90% of our thoughts are actually things coming in from outside. They pop up into your mind, go through their round, pop out, another comes in, and often we have contradictory thoughts floating. Where have you consciously organized your mind and your thought structures and placed your thoughts in a clear structure of relationships to make the mind sufficiently organized and then individualized and then centered around the psychic? The three different things altogether. And if you have not worked upon them, obviously the mind simply just lapses at the time of dissolution. It dissolves. The psychic being withdrawing, or the same with the vital. If you have not organized the vital energies, you do not see this happening. And it's interesting, when you see a person, you can make out often their vital energies are very organized, very individualized. And then you can even recognize if the individualization is simply a strong ego of the vital or something deeper. More often than not, people who have strong vitals are individualized in their ego of the vital and not deeper psychic. There were a few people in the ashram who had actually worked on the vital to centralize and develop them. And one could see immediately, here was a strong personality, but it was utterly dedicated to the mother, living from that deeper aspiration or surrender to her. But very few. And one could sense it. They were the most effective instruments for the mother. But this needs to be worked upon. It needs to be developed. And you will recall our discussion in the study of the Life Divine, where Sri Aurobindo says, unless this is done, unless there's this organization, individualization and centering around the psychic, you cannot carry over the continuity of your consciousness into the next life. And so this is something extremely important that we have to work upon, so that what we have received in this life can be continued into the next, and we don't have to start all over again with a fresh vital and a fresh mental, again disorganized, not remembering, not knowing anything of what we have developed spiritually in this life, and having to start all over again. If we take pains to organize and especially center around the psychic, then we can actually take forward all the benefits of the development, where all the effort you've made to turn your heart, your emotions and your vitality to the Divine Mother, to organize your thoughts around the greater ideal of your spiritual purpose, all this can be actually taken and transplanted into the new body that you take, and you continue where you left off. And it is something so precious if we can do this, and it's worth doing for this reason. Mother then goes to a few examples of what happens in the organization of the mind. She says, take the case of a philosopher or a writer who has worked considerably in his brain, try to organize it. That then persists, but as a capacity to think, nothing else. Because it's not been organized and centered around the psychic. So just the capacity to think. There are these capacities of thinking which persist after death, and they try to naturally to find another physical brain in which to manifest. It is in this way that the mind of a great thinker may identify itself with another mind and be able to express itself. Very interesting. So the person has withdrawn, the soul has withdrawn, but this capacity to think, the organized part of the mental consciousness, that goes out and tries to attach itself to someone else. Or if it's still hanging around, the soul re-entering now to take birth may actually draw upon an impression of something it had created, but now which is available in the general mass of the mental world, drawing something of those elements into itself to imprint into the new mind. But something even more interesting can be possible. From the vital point of view, take the case of a great musician who has worked all his life to make his external being a good instrument for music. He has organized his vital power in his body for playing music well. Well, then his hands, for instance, are so individualized in their ability to play that they persist subtly, even after death, with their form, a form analogous to the old physical hand, to the old physical form. They float in the vital world and are attracted by people who have similar capacities. They try to become identified with them. A person who is sensitive enough, receptive enough, can become identified with these hands and execute wonderful things. Profit by all the individualization of the past life of these hands. So, here is a vital formation, the skill developed in the hands to play. And it can attach itself to somebody who is now beginning. And suddenly you discover this person has a style of play which is similar to such and such a musician. How did that happen? It could be the person dwelt on that person's life, on the musician's life, or remembered him, or liked to play his music, and there was an affinity, and the hands of that musician imprinted themselves into his physical hands. Literally transmitting a vital imprint, an organized vital energy imprint. Now the implications of this are so extraordinary. She is describing only the case where people have organized something and left it behind. As this vital and mental bodies dissolve, these bundles of energy or thought remain hanging around in the universal, attaching themselves, so to say, adding to the possibilities of human play. But if this can happen at the time of dissolution of the vital and mental body, it can equally happen in a consciously developed vital and mental body of a person. And this is the fantastic implication. One who has developed in his hands this kind of consciousness, while living, can imprint what he has developed into another, who may be his student. And in fact, this is what happens unconsciously to us when we learn from someone. So, let's say you go to a great master, he plays wonderfully. You sit with him with your crude, untrained hands. Your first strokes of the violin or the keyboard are crude. But what do? You watch him play. You marvel at how wonderfully he plays. You yearn to play like him, and you have set a relationship of receptivity. And then, as you watch his hands play, you try to feel what his hands are playing. And then when you start playing, you remember what that looked like, what that felt like. And you begin to feel and identify and as if absorb into your hands the imprint of his hands which are trained, his consciousness which is developed. And it's as if on his side, as he watches you play, you will notice the teacher, as the student is playing and he comes to a particular difficult part, the teacher's body tenses and the teacher's hands, yes, that's how you do. The teacher's hands move as if trying to push the student's hands at a distance. There's in fact an identification at the level of the vital energy. In that identification, there's a transmission of the teacher's consciousness of vital into the student's hands. And if the student is receptive, not too egoistically centered in his consciousness, I will do it my way, but I let you do it in me, then there's an imprint which simply flows, fills, and the student catches it. And it's done. And this is the reason why in all of the traditional arts, as they were taught, the first part of the training was to teach the student to become humble, submissive, receptive, and then the teacher could imprint easily. And often the first part involved serving the teacher in their household, looking after him, doing his chores. Why would you do that? How do I develop my finger skill if I'm going to play the keyboard, if I'm washing his floor or preparing food for him? It's the relationship set of the receptivity, of adoration, of creating an environment in which the imprint could take place. But if this is true of the vital, if it is true of the mental consciousness equally, it is so much more true of the spiritual. So, before that, I share another interesting example. The mother narrated this to Panditji after Kapali Shastriyar had passed on. A few years down in the early 1960s, the mother found that when she was working on the body's cellular consciousness to awaken in the cells the aspiration for the divine, she found that the repetition of a certain mantra was helpful. She found it by chance. So she was sitting with the students in the playground, they were watching a movie, and of course the mother sitting there, not because she needed to watch a movie, but because it was the time when, I'm digressing, but it's worth sharing this. What do you see happens when people are watching a movie? They're utterly passive, utterly open, and therefore receptive, often to the junk that comes through the movie, but still. And if at that point when they're passive, sitting around the mother and watching this movie, their mind is engrossed, all the rest of their consciousness is open like this, she can work on them very easily. So she would be sitting with them in the playground while they're watching the movie, and if the movie is selected, she could use it also to imprint good values. So watching the movie, there was a chanting of a mantra, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. And she found every time that it was being repeated, there was immediately a response in the cells of her consciousness. And so she caught that, and she took just the first portion, Om Namo Bhagavate, which was the most powerful part of the response, and began to work on her cellular consciousness through that repetition. At that point, she said, Kapali Shastriyar, who had the mastery of the mantra shastra and its whole domain of knowledge, being in the higher mental worlds, he came to the mother, now no more in the physical body. He comes to the mother who is in the physical body, and he says that I'm very happy that you're interested in the mantras, and if you like, I will give you all the knowledge that I have. Now remember, this is a person who has left his body, has still retained the full knowledge of what he has learned, and this is only possible if his mind was sufficiently organized, individualized, and centered around the psychic. So all that knowledge is actually carried and held by him. And mother says, yes, I'm interested. And then mother described to Panditji, she said, and I opened my mind and he poured all his knowledge into me. You see, what a fantastic possibility. In the mental world, or in the mental body, in the vital body, if we are conscious enough to open in a receptive state, knowledge, a power, or a pattern of energy, of action, can simply be poured or imprinted, and that's it. And mother received all the knowledge that he poured, and she had it. She had the knowledge. This is what is happening in the physical life, in this relationship of the teacher and student, in a much diluted way. But to the extent that we are able to understand this possibility and prepare the necessary ground for it, it can be done in an enormously amplified manner. Of course, the condition of receptivity is key, but on the other side, the capacity to transmit or imprint is also necessary, for which it must be sufficiently organized and developed. So I end with one more example of this, and it was in the case of Pranab Kumar Bhattacharya, who mother selected as the head of the physical education department. There's a whole thing around him, what he represented for the purpose of mother's work. It seems that mother had told Sri Aurobindo about a couple of years before he came that Sri Aurobindo had told the mother that somebody will come soon who will be an instrument of Kali. And his coming will be the beginning of the yoga shifting into the vital. And interestingly, they were working top down to transform. So interestingly, when Pranab came, mother recognized in him that instrument, took him to Sri Aurobindo. Subsequently, the very interesting experiments that the mother did with him, and one of them was this. She said to Pranab one day, today you will play tennis with me. And Pranab says, I'm sorry mother, I have never played tennis, I don't know a thing about tennis. Mother said, don't worry, I will give you the capacity to play. So he didn't understand what she was talking about. He goes and reads books. Oh, this sees pictures. This is called backhand stroke. This is called forehand stroke. These are the rules. Well, with that, what can you do? So he takes the racket for the first time in his life, goes and stands next to the mother as her partner, and begins to play. And he hits the ball perfectly each time. And at the end of the game, people congratulate him saying, you play like a pro, you've been playing for many years. And he said, no, it's the first time I lifted a racket. And he recognized after this what mother had meant. She gave him the power to play. Now what does that mean? The whole imprint in her consciousness of the skill, of the movement, of the stroke of the racket. Where is it stored? It's not in the physical body. The muscular strength is not your key. It is the coordination of the muscles. It's the energies flowing, and even with coordination, it's not your mind. You cannot look at the ball, calculate, and then in your mind work out where to angle your racket to hit exactly. You cannot. It's not a mental experience, it's a vital experience. You look at the ball and you experience in your body the right response, and the body moves and does it. If you try to think it, you will mess it up. So the imprint is in the life force and the instinct of the life force, which if sufficiently conscious and receptive, can receive directly, and mother imprinted her body's life energy pattern, instinct of the stroke of the play into his. And that's it, it was there. If she can do that to him, she can do that to any of us. In fact, as the conscious mother, not just in this particular form, but as conscious divine mother, Shakti of the universe, who is the energy of skill in every human being, in every living being for that matter, she can imprint any of these things into us. Isn't it? The implications of this are extraordinary. And what that means, when we come back to the text, I will amplify on how it was used in the occult traditions, but right now the focus is on the spiritual value of it. Not only the imprint of the life energy can be placed into you just like that and can be gifted, but knowledge in the mind can be poured in, gifted, but equally a spiritual experience can be simply brought down, imprinted, given. And this is the most direct, the most powerful. In fact, if you go deep into the whole question, it is the only way to have a spiritual experience. How do you expect to have the experience of a consciousness which does not belong to you? The only way it can happen is if something of that consciousness enters and settles in you. Isn't it? And what do you need to do for that? Well, create the receptive conditions. Finally, it depends on that consciousness to come down and settle in you. The mother's consciousness giving you is the only way of the Siddhi. Your effort can only create the climate for her to be able to gift it to you. But this principle is so important. So I'll just complete because she gives another interesting example. Someone asks, does the same phenomenon occur in the case of scientists when the result of their work are realized sometime after their death? You see, scientists work for a long time, they may not do it in their life, but soon after they die, someone else gets it. And Mother says, yes. In the case of Pierre and Marie Curie, for example, it is certain that the power of work of Pierre Curie passed into his wife at his death. Because they were close, because they were a couple, a bond and an affinity had been developed, the energy and the power of his work simply transferred into her. Men who undertake, then there's a whole discussion about tombs in Egypt, and we'll skip that. Okay, so now we come back to the text. So remember, when he is describing how influences come from the vital world pouring, they are of this kind. They are not just there to nudge you, to awaken in you emotions or impulses. They also seek to manifest their patterns of energy, their skills and capacities in human beings all the time. So, as we awaken to the higher planes of our existence, we become aware of them as friends or enemies, powers which seek to possess or which we can master, overcome, pass beyond, and leave behind. So in the first movement, so far we were discussing about the influence to possess. On their part, if they can get a grip into your vital, they can infuse so much more of them. In fact, they can enter to such a degree that they become you, or rather you become them, which is often the case in people who align themselves to vital beings, not realizing what it's doing, and after a while their character begins to change until they reflect and even begin to look like those vital beings. You'll see something very interesting. It's almost like an archetype in movies or in picture books for children. When they want to show you somebody who represents the darker side, a bad witch, the face is always distorted. The good person, the face is always, more harmonious. The body similarly, more harmonious or more distorted, depending on what they represent. In the vital world, this is instant, obvious, because form is not rigid, so the form can instantly molds itself. If there's a distortion in the consciousness, it appears as a distortion in the form. That's it. It's obvious. In the physical world, it's not so obvious, because the physical form is rigid and can mask the vital form. But if you're sensitive, you look at the physical face and you say, the person looks nice, but I feel something distorted behind. And if you have a clairvoyant sight, you may see the actual appearance of the person, which is quite different in the vital body, which will be distorted. So what you notice is, as a person aligns itself to an energy which is, let's say, negative, the physical form eventually will begin to become distorted and reflect that form, because the physical follows the vital. Or the vice versa. When your consciousness aligns to a diviner or a more high consciousness, the form begins to reflect that more and more. And one can see this, it's fascinating to observe, and especially in traditions in which there are states of exaltation which are highly valued. So a person enters, let's say, during a ceremony, in the ritual, the person goes through a certain ritual process, invoking the divine presence, and at a certain point it feels as if this person begins to glow, as if he exudes the presence or the power and so on. And they are often exalted as great masters or great teachers or whatever they are representing. But the form as if changes to represent that which fills them. And so the sense of this possessing is not always in a negative way. It can equally be in a positive way. But as long as it is a vital influence, even from the higher worlds of the vital, even from the heavenly realms of the vital, it is still a vital influence. And this is the distinction we will have to make. A purely spiritual influence will not seek to possess by imposition. The purely spiritual will not assert, will not dominate. It will only come if you invite and create the necessary base of purity in which it will not be violated. Whereas the vital being or the vital body or the vital form or energy can push itself, it does not mind mixtures. Now what will be most effective though is, if the spiritual consciousness comes, you are not ready or you are unable to receive, but then it creates a vital formation for effectivity, and then from there connects. And Sri Aurobindo speaks of this. I'm going to read out from this. This is something very interesting and very important. He describes how for each thing created in the physical there's a subtler form and so on, the sheets. And then he says all this shouldn't be taken too rigid and mechanical. It is an immense plastic movement full of play of possibilities. And then he explains now the rationale. 3 points, 2 or 3 points must be pressed in order that this plasticity is not lost to our view. First, each plane, in spite of its connection with others above and below it, is yet a world in itself, with its own movements, forces, beings, types, forms existing as if for its and their own sake, under its own laws, for its own manifestation, without apparent regard for other members of the great series. So each plane tries to do its thing, as if not caring for other planes. Thus, if we regard the vital or the subtle physical plane, we see great ranges of it, most of it existing in themselves, without any relation with the material world and with no movement to affect or influence it, still less to precipitate a corresponding manifestation in the physical formula. So they're not trying to push. They're all too busy with their own, happy with their own. At most, we can say that the existence of anything in the vital, subtle physical or any other plane creates a possibility for a corresponding movement of manifestation in the physical world. In fact, the mother says nothing happens in the physical which does not already correspond to something in one of those planes. But something more is needed to turn that static or latent possibility into a dynamic potentiality. So now this is the interesting part. How is something of that domain, vital or mental, and now we will also take it to the spiritual possibility. How is something of those domains to have an effect here? Something more is needed to turn that static or latent possibility, it could happen, it's there, but into an actual urge towards the material creation. That something may be, now he describes 3 things. That something may be a call from the material plane. For example, some force or someone in the physical existence entering into touch with a supra-physical power or world or part of it and moved to bring it down into the earth life. So the first thing required from the physical domain, somebody looking at that and saying, this I want, and the call. Now see how important this is for the spiritual manifestation. He is describing the vital and mental, but still. Or, second possibility, it may be an impulse in the vital or other plane itself. A vital being moved to extend his action towards the earth and establish there a kingdom for himself, or the play of the forces for which he stands in his own domain. Let's take a few positive examples. The vital being here is belonging to a domain of cure, good health, well-being. You enter those domains in your dream state, in your vital body, and all your maladies are cured. You come out rejuvenated. So such a being of rejuvenation, and there are many beings of that kind who specialize in even certain aspects of it. Such a being says, here on earth I want to help human beings. And so it wants to extend what it has there into the earth place. Or, third possibility, or it may be a pressure from above, let us say some supramental or mental power, precipitating its formation from above and developing forms and movements on the vital level as a means of transit to its self-creation in the material world. Fascinating. So from the spiritual or even mental domains, something comes down, but before it can transit to the physical world, it needs to organize the vital base. Why is that? Because remember, the physical world itself is a projection of the vital. See, all the key laws he has already described earlier, and we have been elaborating over the last few weeks. You cannot enter the physical world, you cannot act in the physical world unless you have something of the vital basis which connects into the physical. So even a spiritual force coming has to pass through the vital. If it bypasses the vital completely, its effect on the physical will be so subtle you will barely feel it. So you're sitting quietly, let's say the vital is completely bypassed and there's an action taking place, you feel suddenly, it feels so vast, so wide, something very light, and that's about it. But if it has come through the vital and acted in your inner, particularly the inner vital and inner subtle physical ranges, then suddenly you feel this deep, dense, intense, substantial presence, vastness or power or whatever the particular quality that comes. So it may create, it may develop forms and movements on the vital level as a means of transit to its self-creation in the material world. But that means its origin is well above, in the mental or even all the way to the supramental. Or, fourth possibility, which is really a combination, or it may be all these things acting together, in which case there is the greatest possibility of an effective creation. So let's review that. Here's somebody on earth who is consciously invoking. Here is a power on the vital or mental plane that has already what you are seeking and wants now to assist and participate. And high above, from the spiritual plane, a movement comes to manifest such a possibility, seizing upon the already existing vital domains where it is organized as a vital energy, or creating there its vital possibilities and then connecting to this aspiring receptive individual. And you have the effective manifestation. Every new great breakthrough, every new creation, every new possibility organized in individual life, collective life, even something which is a physical invention, an engineering creation, a community with new values, a humanity, or even a civilization in which a new possibility, a new value, a new ideal has been imprinted, has had these three things. Let's take a dramatic example in the French Revolution. An idea comes Sri Aurobindo describes in Thoughts and Aphorisms, a yogi in the Himalayas dreamt of liberty, equality, fraternity. Now, coming from a high spiritual consciousness, dwelling upon these ideals, and from there turning upon the world and saying, oh, I wish these were manifested. So the push comes from there. In the vital domains, there is already realms which represent these powers organized in their own particular way. In the mental world, similarly, similar things exist. And on the physical world, a few individuals. Which part of the earth? Remember, the influence from the spirit is on the whole earth. Which part of the earth is most open to these ideals at that moment? And it was in France. And in France, there were a few individuals who were particularly ready. Why? Go back a few decades. And then there are writers, philosophers. They were not political activists who were saying, what would be an ideal society be like? And they threw in seeds of these ideas. Those seeds spread, a few individuals caught. And at that moment, when from above the impetus begins, it catches those formations in the mental, vital worlds, aligns to individuals, and if there is a large enough group, it triggers a revolution, a civilizational shift, civilizational change. Now, if it was purely a vital construction or a mental construction, it would have stopped with France and even perhaps faded out and be reversed. Typically, a pure vital manifestation has its opposite, which follows soon after, and often the whole thing is lost. But because its origin was in the spiritual, not only it sustained, it stopped short of what it could do because of the limitations of the people where the manifestation took place, or the culture had its limitations. It stopped its social and political change, did not go deep enough. But what it accomplished stayed to this day, but also spread into the whole world. Because it was a spiritual source, its action was meant for the earth. It used that focal point, and the vital drama associated with that focal point, of course, was terrible, including all the guillotines and all the self-destructive. Even the people who started the revolution had to face the guillotine eventually, typically again part of the vital distortions. But since behind even the vital distortion was the spiritual power, it eventually settled, fulfilled to whatever degree humanity was ready, spread upon the earth, and those values somehow are now imprinted everywhere, in all the cultures, all nations. Where they are not, people recognize that it is something retrograde. And those are seen as backward places on earth. And this is how you will recognize that there was a spiritual power behind it. So Sri Aurobindo is describing the alignment of these, all these things acting together, in which case there is the greatest possibility of an effective creation. Then he goes to point number 2, and then there's a point number 3, where he describes, maybe we'll just read it, it's worth. Next, as a consequence, it follows that only a limited part of the action of the vital or other higher planes is concerned with the earth existence. Because they're all busy in their own world, they're not really worried about here. A tiny part is concerned. But even this creates a mass of possibilities which is far greater than the earth can at one time manifest or contain in its own less plastic formula. Now you'll recall this was part of an earlier discussion in the previous paragraph, where he said, because the physical world is a world of form and rigidity of form, you can only hold one thing at a time. Whereas in the vital world, because it is a domain of energies, you can have multiple energies at the same time, and therefore creating as if strata, gradations of worlds. And so in the mental. And a very rich, almost an infinite ranges. And each can be infinite in its scope and totally different from others. But in the physical world, how much can you manage? And if there are two very different ideas, let's say the ideal of liberty and the ideal of equality competing to manifest, well, they will create their own space. This part equality, that part liberty, and the two will collide. But you cannot have in the same space two ideals which seem to be diametrically opposite, competing. So, the possibilities in the physical world, you can only have multiple possibilities in different regions. So, all these possibilities do not realize themselves. Some fail altogether and leave at the most an idea that comes to nothing. Look back at history and so many wonderful ideas which people had. Some try seriously and are repelled and defeated, and even in action for a time come to nothing. So the force may come, the attempt to manifest, repelled or defeated. Others effectuate a half manifestation. That's a good example with the French Revolution. And this is the most usual result. The more so as these vital or other supraphysical forces come into conflict and have not only to overcome the resistance of the physical consciousness and of matter, but their own internecine resistance to each other. So this is the great insight. These forces coming through often end up in contradiction to each other. In their own domain, in the vital, they just form different worlds. But when they aim to manifest in the physical world, you have one shared reality, and so they collide. And when they collide, they carve out their separate territories, either in individuals or in communities, in nations, civilizations, even across planets. On one planet, this ideal works out, on another, that ideal works out. As long as they're separate, it's fine. But when they meet, you have a collision. Eventually, there's always a collision. And the great collision which we see in the context of the example earlier, liberty and equality. Sri Aurobindo explains how the communist system attempted to realize equality by suppressing liberty. The capitalist system tried to realize liberty, suppressing equality. The two collide. How do you harmonize? And then he says that's when you need the third ideal, which is a fraternity, which alone can make the base in which the two can unite. But again, the two are being almost opposing ideals. The extent of the fraternity determines the extent of their harmonization. As long as the fraternity is economic, well, their harmonization will be limited. If the fraternity is political, it's limited. It's social, again, limited. It is only when the fraternity goes all the way down in its roots to the spiritual that we are all equally souls in evolution, we are all equally children of the divine, we are all equally one self, taking so many different individualizations, that we can experience equality and liberty with full play, without conflict, without collision, and without dilution. Auroville is precisely meant to be one such space. And you will see in the context of this discussion, Mother looking at creating the whole spiritual framework that is Auroville, or the inspiration of Auroville, and bringing it down, imprinting it through the mental, through the vital, into the physical. And because it comes from that highest consciousness, even we will say from the supramental, which is its origin, when she was asked on what does the success of Auroville depend, she says, happily it doesn't depend on human beings. And yet, human beings can delay, can create confusion, can add conflict. But in spite of that, it will work because its origin is thus, because its action is so projected through all these levels with the full force of the spiritual. And because humanity has come at least to some level where it can receive that spiritual ideal without the failure which you see, or the partial success that you see in the French Revolution. Of course, if human beings collaborate, and even with just goodwill, the whole thing could happen so much more quickly, so much more smoothly, with such less confusion, and so on. But even if they don't, eventually the power has the capacity to create the necessary human capacities, overcome their conflicts, even use their conflicts to accelerate its own development. And that's the character of the spiritual action. But the point Sri Aurobindo makes here is, when the origin is from these domains, or when they have to act through these domains, there is an internecine conflict of interests or energies or the forces particularly when coming from the vital. But that's necessary if you have to manifest. So it's almost as if unavoidable. This is something so simply stated, but so fundamental in its reality, that we could actually spend a few hours looking at examples of conflicts in communities, in systems, in collectivities of even business interests or national interests, and understand how the action even of an ideal has to work through the vital, how the vital conflicts takes place, but how the spiritual can work around the conflict and even use it. But this is something which Sri Aurobindo always points to fundamental principles, and we have to dwell upon them to fully appreciate. So, coming back to the text, so internecine conflict is what he described. A certain number succeed in precipitating their results in a more complete and successful creation, so that if you compare that creation with its original in the higher plane, there is something like a close resemblance, or even an apparently exact reproduction or translation from the supraphysical to the physical formula. Visually, it will have exactness. There's an interesting example of this. If you go to Italy, there's a community there formed which has dug into the mountain. From outside, you just see a few buildings. You go in, and then they go down inside the mountain, underground, and they've created layers and layers of caves. And you look around inside, beautiful paintings, sculptures, and it is entirely a reproduction of one of the vital domains. The founder of the community is a strong, or associated with a strong vital being, and the whole community is seeped in with that, maybe a benevolent being, but still it's seeped in with that particular world of the vital. Quite mesmerizing, very attractive, seductive on a certain level. But then you ask, and then what? Nothing. Just have pretty rooms with pretty pictures, and then what? Nothing. There's nothing of the spiritual touch in it. And it even in some way represents or captures a mood of one of the cycles of an earlier civilization, of an Atlantean phase. It's as if capturing something of that. In image, therefore, in the quality reflected in the forms and images, perfect reproduction of the domain of the vital, of that world or being, which is the inspiration behind it. But then, at least being in the vital world, you would experience that vital energy. Here it's maybe mildly diluted, but there's nothing you can do with it. And so something happens, even when the image is a reproduction. And she says, and Sri Aurobindo says, and yet, even there, the exactness is only apparent. The very fact of translation into another substance and another rhythm of manifestation makes a difference. Somehow in the physical world, the character of the vital experience is dimmed or even lost. It is something new that has manifested, and it is that makes the creation worthwhile. Now, even when it has manifested successfully, the character of the physical world is rigidity of form, and the images stay static. In the vital world, if you enter that domain, the forms are fluid, they are changing. You do not have the same experience. But in the physical world, it is not only the same, sustained, but it is objectivized. 10 people can go look at the same image and appreciate the image. If those 10 entered the vital world in that particular grade, they would each experience it differently. So something new is created here. And now Sri Aurobindo, having described the vital, he links the same principle now to the spiritual. What, for instance, would be the utility of a supramental creation on earth if it were just the same thing as a supramental creation on the supramental plane? Because it's already there. What's the point of replicating? It is that in principle, but yet something else. A triumphant new self-discovery of the divine in conditions that are not elsewhere. The very fact of bringing the supramental into the physical plane gives to the whole experience something which was never existent in any of the earlier domains, and allows you for a shared, objectivized experience of that divinity in conditions that are not elsewhere. And then one more example. No doubt, the subtle physical is closest to the physical and most like it. But yet the conditions are different, and the thing too different. For instance, the subtle physical has a freedom, plasticity, intensity, power, color, wide and manifold play. There are thousands of things there that are not here, of which as yet we have no possibility on earth. Freedom, the consciousness there itself feels so wide. The thing feels wide. The flower, which was just a moment ago open, would be experienced in the subtle physical as having an imprint which is wide. It doesn't stop with the borderline of the form. Plasticity, the form has a fluidity and therefore an ability to be perfect, flawless even. Intensity, so even something experienced in the subtle physical, even as an image, has a full, rich intensity which is overwhelming to the physical senses. Power, color, wide and manifold play. Mother observes how in the subtle physical realm, the range of colors is so great, the intensity and depth of the colors so great, even the translucence, light in the color is so great. There's nothing possible equivalent in the physical world, but she says, and she's looking at the future, she says, eventually they'll find a way to represent that in the physical world. And this we see today in computer screens, where the range of colors is so much greater, the lucidity and the translucency of the colors, and still it has the flat character. A shift from there to a three-dimensional representation would come much closer to the kind of experience of the subtle physical. And so Sri Aurobindo continues, and yet there is something here, a potentiality of the divine which the other, in spite of its greater liberties, has not. Something which makes creation more difficult, but in the last result justifies the labor. Then he speaks of how each plane has the principle of other planes in itself, and that makes for many things. We will skip that now. Coming back to the text, remember we were at this line where he's speaking of influences. So as we awaken to the higher planes of our existence, we become aware of them, these beings, as friends or enemies, powers which seek to possess. There's always this influence on us. But on the other side, the reversal is possible, or which we can master. So here is a power that is trying to manifest from the vital plane. And you could say, fine, I choose to become an instrument for it. May be useful if the power is trying to do good. But it will be much more useful because we are not vital beings. We are mental beings first and foremost. It will be much more useful if we can act as mental beings first. And instead of being merely tools for the vital influence, as a mental being of a higher grade of possibility, we receive or master what the vital has to offer, and then shape and recast it in terms of a higher mental or perhaps even a spiritual reference or value. So the same, let's say, vital influence that came to create a space for healing, the mind stands back above, and what the vital could create is wonderful, but the mind can add to it, and if there's a spiritual force above that, it can build something which will be so much greater, which the vital could not have done on its own, but it would still have the full participation and power of the vital to make the spiritual ideal effective. But the vital subdued to the spiritual. Now, so here comes the second requirement or possibility on our part. The powers seek to possess, but we can reverse and we can master those powers. Not only that, having mastered them, you rise above to a higher possibility, overcome there's a point where what the vital could afford as a basis is even limited. And so you rise to a grade of possibility which is greater, now no more bound to the limitation. Overcome, pass beyond and leave behind. Now this is extremely important, in fact is at the very root of the old magical systems of conscious evolution, even what were presented as spiritual methods, and the principle it describes applies equally to the mental worlds and even to some of the spiritual beings above. So the way it works is this: in the magical systems, in let's say the traditions which you see in the Kabbalah, or in some of the more recent traditions in the Rosicrucian tradition or the Freemasonic tradition and various variants of those, the method they would follow, they would consider each step of consciousness as not only levels but also with beings presiding over those. You entered in relation to a being, asked their help, effectively became an instrument for that being, and then you would acquire a certain power corresponding to that level. And then after that you had to outgrow that, rise above it, not get stuck in the power itself, because having a power, obviously the ego seizes upon the power or gets under control of the power. You would rise above it and eventually get free of it to a greater freedom by help of the next being in the sequence in the stairs. The same idea you will see even in the Vedic tradition. You invoke a deity who awakens in you a consciousness, and then you go to the next and the next. Now remember, we link this now to the earlier discussion about how something can be imprinted in us directly. A power of consciousness, an awakening of consciousness. So a vital being would assist in awakening a vital capacity or a vital change in your consciousness. Perhaps even a great purity of your vital can be thus received or imprinted from one of these domains. But in the very act of doing that, you would put yourself in dependence on that being. And then you would have to as if rise above and outgrow it by the help of the next and the next and the next. So it was always one rung of the stair that you hold, pull, and as you rise there's a point where you cross, and if you don't let go, you're stuck there. But in order to be able to let go of this, you grab the next one. And then as if you let go this, except, and this is the problem with the approach, you want to let it go, but it doesn't want to let you go. Interesting. It will not leave you because it says, you belong to me. I just gave myself to you, and I'm not going to let go of this very convenient relationship that I have. And so difficult now to let go. How do you let go? And when you let go, it may even hit back, unless you have fulfilled the conditions by which it no more can have a hold on you, which you do now with the help of the next rung, and the next, and the next. What a slow, laborious process. And so you will see in all these systems, they have clear hierarchical stages. If you see in the Freemasonic order, they will have 33 steps, each of which is symbolic of a certain spiritual development acquired, reaching the 33rd. Interesting why they have 33. It's symbolic of the 3.5 of the Kundalini wrapped up at the base of the spine. But the idea is you are as if going through a progression in a sequence or an ascent in a sequence, at the end of which you will be this liberated master. Except, and this is the tricky part, which beings were you interacting with? The easiest to engage with are the vital. And they may be vital beings representative of a spiritual. You will remember we read last time of this observation that the mother makes of the little Kali and the little Durga. And they are as if emanations of the spiritual beings in the vital world for a particular action there. And so almost all these systems engaged themselves with the vital worlds, and so saw the heavens of the vital worlds as spiritual, the beings of the vital worlds as spiritual, and they were not wrong because they were emanations of the spiritual beings, but they were not right because we stopped with those emanations as the spiritual being. And the result was, having progressed all the way to the top, your 33rd degree, you're supposed to be master now of all the forces, liberated to whatever extent, but you have not entered the consciousness of the self. Your liberation is only now a freedom of your ego to be able to freely fulfill its desires. And you will see inevitably most of these magical systems end up with this conclusion that the whole goal of magic is to be free to act according to your will, according to your desire, to be able to do whatever you want, and it stops short and completely misses the point of the spiritual awakening. Whereas the pure spiritual traditions, and often very ascetic in their approach, would attempt to bypass this domain precisely for this. Don't take help of inferior stages, go straight to the highest source. But the highest is abstract. You are unable to reach it except by complete dissolution of form, and therefore more difficult. Not easy for the common man to begin, and there are no clear steps, obviously, or maybe broad stages of dissolution, etc. And somewhere in between is the truth. And the truth which is taken up in the approach of the integral yoga is not relating to these intermediate powers, not even in their overmental station, and especially not in their reflection or secondary representations in the vital or the mental worlds, but we put ourselves directly in the hands of the Divine Mother, the Divine Shakti, who is the mother of all these gods who represent different aspects, powers of her consciousness. But as aspects and powers of consciousness, they are each specialized and can enter into collision. So an overmental realization of a community, a spiritual community, and even though overmental with all the power of the overmental and the infinity of the overmental, would still be a specialized aspect, and another overmental community would be a different specialized aspect. The two, when they meet, would be in collision. And it is when you align to the Divine Mother Shakti, of whom all are aspects equally, that she pours herself into you, individually, collectively, and in the community allows an extraordinary richness and diversity of possibilities, held by that central reality of the Divine Mother, always. And she can act from her spiritual source in the mental and in the vital and eventually in the physical, but top down. Not climbing from below through the vital and mental to the spiritual, but an action of the spiritual directly upon your higher parts first, in the highest part of your mind, in the highest part of your emotions, turned to the divine in a conscious self-giving, creating thereby the climate in which she can directly imprint her purity, her light, her force, her power, her knowledge in these parts to the extent they are ready and pure and receptive. Remember the discussion we had earlier about the imprinting power? And so from top down she begins the process of purifying you and restructuring, reorganizing, transforming and perfecting. On multiple levels at the same time, in different parts of your consciousness at the same time, wherever most receptive the action begins, through that it prepares the action at a level less receptive, opens it, awakens and turns it to her to be more receptive, and so on. Something so complex, so multifaceted that you cannot reduce to a system. You cannot reduce to fixed rungs of steps of a system. And yet it has broad principles, more fluid, more flexible. There are stages, there are things to be done, but the nature of the action is so multifaceted that even we may not be fully conscious of the work. We may be conscious of a one part which is largely open to her in our mind or in our heart, and through that perhaps we become conscious eventually of other things. Oh, I notice that even in my body certain things have changed. Even certain illnesses have become now less intense. How did that happen? And I'm conscious that it was the action of her force working within me. And so the whole approach is fundamentally different from this. But you can see the validity or the rationale of this approach And you can see why at a particular phase of human development this approach was so valuable and even necessary. And so Sri Aurobindo concludes, having described all this, powers which we seek to possess or which we can master, overcome, pass beyond and leave behind, which was the way the whole process went. It is this possible relation of the human being with the powers of the life world which occupied to so large an extent European occultism, especially in the Middle Ages, as well as certain forms of Eastern magic and spiritualism. In India, particularly in the Tantric tradition, it was to this focus that the whole development finally limited itself. Although in its origin the concept of the Tantric approach was surrender directly to the divine Shakti as the Shakti of the universe, of the world, even transcendent, in practice over time it took this form. While this was happening in Europe in the Middle Ages, in India at the same time it was happening in a different way. Her power in nature, through nature, and particularly in her operations in the vital nature, which are most immediately useful for us, not only for our self-improvement, internal change, but also our exercise of power on the world and in nature's processes or in circumstances of life. And you'll see the bulk of the Tantric texts which survive, which go into formulae, are all focused on acquiring powers, catching a particular operation of the divine Shakti in the vital plane for a specific purpose, seizing upon it and mastering it or subduing it to become effective in the world. Almost the bulk of the material is of that grade. Useful perhaps, at least when used for good, for healing, for changing spaces, revitalizing a desert into a blooming garden. All of these formulas might have been useful, but spiritually of no value. There are a few Tantric texts which have great spiritual value. They relate directly to the Divine Mother, invocation of her different aspects and names and so on, but they do not concern themselves with formulae primarily, and especially formulae which engage with the vital representation of the Divine Mother. Even exercises which involve yantras, the symbols, drawings and material objects, primarily engage with the vital representation of the Divine Mother's action in the world, which is your closest link point and intermediary to her. So it is not the Divine Mother in her spiritual liberation, but it is Divine Mother in her vital action or her mastery of the vital worlds. Even she can be wide and infinite in the vital, but in her vital representation which is tapped through those mechanisms. The pure spiritual does not need or cannot be trapped by mechanisms and symbols. At best, they are symbols and representations for the mind to focus upon and through it to reach out. But then if you have reached that point already, the symbol is secondary. Will you draw the traditional particular symbol which represents the working of the Divine Mother in the vital world? Or in your mind, it is only Mother. The name Mother is your symbol, and through that name you connect indirectly into her spiritual reality. And this is the reason why in the integral yoga none of these things are necessary. They're not only an obstruction, they're discarded. And so when you ask Sri Aurobindo, what's the mantra? He said, well, in this yoga primary mantra is Mother's name or my name, he says. So you say Sri Aurobindo, you say the Mother, or any particular way that you relate to them, that's your name, that's your mantra. And if you look at those complicated systems with such detailed structures and processes, and here's Sri Aurobindo saying this, it looks so simplistic to be almost to that mindset. Hey, they don't have a structure, they don't have a practice, so it seems. Compared to a system where you follow this name, arrange this way, draw triangles, squares, circles, put this incense, repeat so many times, and you will have a breakthrough after doing it long enough. And of course it's effective, of course it helps you to nudge a little more each time, but you're still relating to the representation of the Divine Mother in the vital, not even in the mental. And you can easily reach experiences of vital heavens, and they are wonderful and splendorous, but it will not liberate you entirely in the spiritual. If you have from the beginning a very clear spiritual focus, those methods can help, but at some point it is your exclusive focus on the spiritual which will give you the breakthrough and the transcendence, even as you use those methods. And such people are very few in history. It's the reason why, looking back, you do not find people having gone through methods who have reached the spiritual in every tradition and at every generation. They will say something like, oh, so-and-so master had reached great heights, but now we are following the same method he was following, but we don't reach the same great heights. Why? Because we concentrated on the immediate focus of the method, which was the vital representation of the divine. So you understand the importance of this at a certain phase. In European occultism, especially in the Middle Ages, it was so prevalent. In India, around the same time, you will find similar things happening, not so rigidly structured in schools and secret societies, which was the way in Europe. In India, the field was open, so people who went into it, they left the normal life, they went into it and had full access, or they stayed in normal life and had no access. But beyond that, you didn't have hierarchies and secret societies to deal with. But they all fell short, and therefore you do not see the spiritual awakening and the breakthrough which it should have taken to if it had been purely a spiritual exercise. Even in India, the greatest saints were those, even in the Bhakti tradition, who went directly into the experience through the sheer concentration of their will and self-surrender, not needing such methods. But still we understand the rationale, and this is important. Sri Aurobindo now moves on. The superstitions of the past, much superstition there was, that is to say, much ignorant and distorted belief, false explanations, and obscure and clumsy dealings with the laws of the beyond, had yet behind them truths which a future science, delivered from its sole preoccupation with the material world, may rediscover. So that phase, a lot of confusion with it, had to end because of the confusion. And superstition is not, as people normally interpret it to be, falsehood. It is rather, he says, ignorant and distorted belief or false explanation, obscure and clumsy dealings with the laws of the beyond. Why? Because we attempted to understand those laws in terms of this world, and so misread, misapplied, or clumsily managed what could have been done much more simply, directly and purely. So actually this sentence is very important. He gives you a list: ignorant, distorted belief, false explanation, obscure, clumsy dealing. And why is he using so many words? Because each of them represents an aspect of the distortion. I would have liked to dwell upon each with a few examples to show how those work. What's the difference between false explanation or obscure dealing or clumsy dealing or distorted belief? And maybe we will do that the next time. But right now we just understand behind them truths which are meant to be realized eventually by future science, delivered from its sole preoccupation with the material world. For the supra-material is as much a reality as the existence of mental beings in the material universe. And another of his extraordinary statements. He doesn't say the supra-material is as real as the physical. He says is as much reality as the existence of mental beings in the material universe. Why is he saying that? The very fact that we are mental beings means that a mental world exists and is as real as your mental experience of the physical world. But there are further implications to this which also we will explore next time, which unfortunately will be after a gap of almost a little more than a month. I will be out of station, and we will continue this passage on, we will resume this on July 26th. We will have the Sunday class this Sunday, but after that I will be going out. And so July 26th If you need a reminder, for those of you who are coming regularly, I think you can give your names to Antim and he will send you an email as a reminder a week before. But otherwise, we'll pause here and take up any questions or comments. It's such a fascinating field. Sri Aurobindo going to the root principles makes it seem deceptively simple. But when we look at the implications, they are so rich, so complex, and at the base of so many complex practices. But while he's speaking of the vital world, the implications equally apply to the mental and even more when we enter the spiritual domain with suitable modifications. And so exploring it in this kind of a comprehensive way gives us the greatest benefit. If Sri Aurobindo had had to do that in his writing, the book would be 10 times bigger. So obviously he stays with concentrated things, and then when he comes to the mental, he will say broadly similar to what we have discussed before, but with these modifications. And then he just has the minimum required in terms of words. But that requires us now to go back and see what is common with the mental, what is common with the spiritual, and then what is different also. Yes. Slightly louder.
Which world is the soul of being is interacting with when a person is dreaming or is having life?
Reading?
Is dreaming.
Dreaming. Okay. So in the dream, the bulk of what we experience in dream is in the vital worlds. The bulk of it. There may be certain elements which relate to the mental world, but very little. The bulk of it is always in the vital, but within the vital, as was discussed in earlier, there's a full spectrum from the lowest and often darkest hellish regions to the highest heavenly realms. And which of these gradations of the vital you touch, and sometimes you touch multiple of them, depends on what is the average grade of your vital consciousness. So a person who in their quality of emotions and life energies is always living in something which is refined, turned towards beauty, turned towards aesthetics, will tend to enter dream state into those grades of the vital worlds. See, unlike the physical world, the vital has many fine grades internally, each as a world in itself. Whereas somebody who's had a bad day, who's been full of anger or some strong, intense, darker emotions, will tend to slip into that grade at night and replicate or experience that grade of reality.
So, is a dream a reflection of the internal memories, or is kind of an forewarning that the person is going to experience?
Actually, the dream has all three components. A large part of the dream ends up reflecting what is already within you, in part because that's the grade of consciousness you entered, but also because habitual tendencies tend to recur in the dream. So if in the normal life you're always in a state of stress or tension and barking and irritable, well, in the dream state you'll find yourself doing those things. I recently had a meeting with somebody and he was saying, oh, in my dream I'm sitting all the time in my office and meeting customers. Because the whole day his consciousness is in that's his reality, that's his world. So he slips into that. And yet it's different. Because in the vital world, you are replicating the grade of consciousness, the forms are more fluid, more varied. And it can take on strange forms. For example, if your relationship with your customers, let's say in this case of this man, was one of being always in fear. Oh, this fellow is going to come, he's going to challenge me, he's going to accuse me of something. I'm always in a state of fear base. In the dream, I will find myself being attacked by little animals jumping at me, which represent the energy of the customers. If in my life, my relationship with customers is, I have to somehow convince them to invest more, to do this, I'm always trying to reach out and sway them, in the dream state, the energetic representation of it may take a different form. I am trying to shape matter, but the matter slips back into what it was. Or I am trying to pull people and they keep falling back. You see, it is the energetic representation, not always a literal form. Okay? So this is one kind of dream. Another kind of dream is something which is more symbolic, of a deeper part of you, which stands back from this life and says, is that all I am going to do? Is there something more meaningful? And that may appear in the dream state in a symbolic form that says, suddenly all my teeth fell out. Or suddenly the house which I built, there was a whirlwind and it broke apart. What was that? Symbolically, this relationship that you have created in your surface part of life, a deeper part says, enough of this, I want to break. And it may be a precursor to a great change in your life. But the third type of dream is literally premonitory, when as your consciousness is returning, it approaches close to the physical world and it catches tendencies pushing down from the vital and mental to the physical. It catches tendencies which are on the brink of realization. And so you see those events, you wake up, and in the day, the same thing recurs. Because you caught that movement before it hooked into the physical. And that's why the dreams of early morning, when you're closest to the physical, on the brink of waking up, they are the ones which tend to be premonitory. Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Symbols can be very effective in fixing in the physical, but what's the intermediate link point? The vital. Because the symbol has a certain power and a part of your mind gives to it that value, these are your link points which give to the symbol their effectivity. Now, a symbol may not have been created by somebody, it may not have been natural, but just that a group of people accepts this as their symbol gives to it now the power. Who created it? Your mind, your vital energies, and the respect you poured upon it, the strength you gave to it now acquires an effect. And of course, in the case of the mother's symbol or Sri Aurobindo's symbol, they gave to it a certain force, but also the symbol was meant to represent a certain cosmic arrangement of powers, but they gave to it a certain force, and so it carries that force. Equally, though, we can, just as we can give to a symbol a power, we can also weaken its power by misuse or disuse. You will see people putting mother's symbol on any piece of paper. It goes as a letter. The person reads the letter, acts upon it, tears it up and throws it in the waste paper basket. Now, if you actually thought about what the symbol represents and held to it the value, here is mother's force, you could never tear that letter or throw it in the waste paper basket. But you're able to do it because you've already become immune to the meaning of the symbol. You have already deprecated its value, weakened it, at least in terms of the effect it can have for you. And so these are constantly changing dynamics of the power of symbols. But yes, symbol can act as a focal point. At the end of the day, it does not matter if it was in this way. Anything to which you gave the power becomes for you then a link point and has the power of that symbolism. Even dates similarly. Yes. 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 Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Right. Yes. Yeah. Mhm. Today is the birthday of my teacher MP Pandit. This morning we released a special card, and it's kept here at the top. For those of you who have not received it, you're welcome to take one as you leave. In conclusion, the most important, the most powerful symbol is yourself. You are a representation of the whole cosmos. Rather than fixating on an external symbol indirectly, if you become conscious of yourself, the part of you that aspires to the divine, the part of you that is conscious of the divine presence within of the psychic being, the part of you that knows that this life is not by chance, that you're born for a purpose, that there's something important to be realized. That part of you is already one with the truth that it represents. And as a part, it is a symbol. And if you concentrate on these things within you, if you amplify and spread their influence into you, your whole being, including your mind, life, and physical body, more and more grows to represent that which it symbolizes. And in a sense, the yoga is nothing but the completion of this process, where rather than being physical symbols, we become physical manifestations of the divine reality. And that's why the most powerful method in the yoga is the direct method of your consciousness entering in direct relation to the divine, opening itself and allowing the divine to fill, imprint, possess, reshape and transform us. And that's what we have to take from this discussion. The vital, physical and the mental have their own complex relations, but each is also a symbol and a representation of aspects of the divine. And to the extent that they open to the divine, they become its agents for the divine manifestation. We'll continue this on 26th of July. Om.